Dr. Chuck the Science Schmuck.
Synchronize. You see it. You definitely see it. I don't. Why do I not? Because I don't. That's tautological. What I'm referring to is this. These. Everywhere. It's on me. It's on the wall. But I can't see it. What is it? Scan lines. You might have noticed this in a few of my more recent videos. There's these constant sort of black marks that are only slightly visible. They're usually most visible when I suddenly cut, because if you don't really pay attention, you can't quite see them. But I notice them, because I can't pay for an editor, so I have to edit these videos. And I'm staring at it like, ooh, scan lines. Well, right now I'm staring. Wood. But that's not the point. The point is, I'm interested in fixing these scan lines. How am I going to do that? With science, of course. Now the question is, what are actually causing these scan lines? Let me answer that. The scan line issue started when I began using this. Now what is this? This is a shop light. Oh, the light! Hold on a second. Oh, why? Oh. Sorry, it's a little dim. I think it's dim. I can't tell. I'm slightly blind now. This is a shop light that I get from Walmart. I originally used these in my underground garden, which is probably either the video before this or the video after this. Sneak preview or recap, don't know which. I'm rebuilding it. I deactivate it during the summer though because it consumes a lot of power. This model is the $30 one, which uses about 45 to 50 watts of power. Now, if you look inside of it, what do you see? These aren't fluorescent lights. These are strips covered in polycarbonate of LEDs. Now, if I pointed at you, you can't exactly see a scan line, now can you? Just a bunch of dust. If I pointed at me, maybe you can see it. It's a little hard. Now, I'm staring straight at these. Oh, and I'm not having fun doing it. What am I actually looking at? LEDs are essentially the source of the scan lines in this case. You notice that with this turned off, although it's dim, probably, I can't tell, I shouldn't be having the scan line problem. I can't actually tell because the scan lines are not visible in real life. Why are the scan lines visible to you, but not to me? The answer is because up until a few seconds ago, I had human vision, whereas you are a camera. Not actually, I don't think so, unless the robots have gotten a lot farther than I thought in the last 100 years since I made this video. So this is complicated, and I'm going to go through this in several steps. So as I said, light-emitting diodes. These little chips are light-emitting diodes. What's a diode? Well, that could be an entire college degree. That could be an entire course. It is. It's called semiconductor engineering. A diode is a semiconductor light source. So, let me sniff this marker. I actually won't, because sniffing markers will give you a terrible headache. Well, at least it's still good. Mold issue. A diode is a system that was invented probably starting in the 1940s, 1930s-ish, when the diodes were first discovered, which is a type of semiconductor junction device. So, to depict it, I mean, here I've got the schematic symbol of a diode. The line is always on the negative side, and then a picture of a diode in terms of what it actually looks like in a simplified version. And now, I'm not an electrical engineer, and I'm not a semiconductor physicist. That is a very complicated and difficult job. So this is just going to be the most rudimentary description of how a diode actually operates. A diode is made of a semiconducting material, where you have two different materials. The easiest way to think of it is as silicon. They are made in such a way so that electrons can easily flow out of one and be easily accepted by the other, just in terms of material properties. You can think of it that the negative side, will easily give up its electrons, whereas this side will easily take electrons because they're doped with different chemicals that do that. So that when electricity is applied directionally, electrons are negatively charged, so they flow from negative to positive. Electricity comes in, and then this side is more than willing to give up its electrons to this side, which is more than willing to take them, and they head outward. You say, why is that useful? Well, because it doesn't really work the other way. If you apply electricity in reverse, so say we turn this negative and this positive, you're sending electrons in here. This side is willing to take them, but not very readily willing to give them up. So it does not want to give electrons over here. And it won't. This side also is full of electrons, and it doesn't want to take any more. So the electricity will not flow in reverse to a point. Diodes have what's called a reverse breakdown voltage, which means if you put enough electricity in there, they will flow the other way. Now, what does this mean in the context of an LED? LED, I probably don't need to explain this because you're all a lot smarter than me. LED is a light-emitting diode. So when a diode is running, there's kind of this intermediate area in the center where the electrons are moving between the junctions. This area does generate light because electrons moving produces photons. Like, that's pretty basic physics. That's like third grade stuff. When an electron jumps an orbital shell and falls back down or moves in some way, it releases a photon, which is a small amount of energy. Because the electrons are jumping around all over the place in here as they pass, it generates light. This was first observed in the earliest diodes. I believe technically rectifier tubes were first, which a rectifier tube is just like a light bulb with an electric probe in it. They're not really diodes. Like selenium rectifiers, this would have been observed. Silicon rectifiers, which are really common, do this. Every diode does this. Every diode that exists generates a small amount of light when it operates. It's just that in the case of LEDs, LEDs are not silicon, generally speaking. I believe gallium arsenide, which you definitely don't want to eat, but I'd want to eat it, it is part of the ingredients, but there's different semiconductor substances. They're optimized so that when this occurs at this juncture, a large amount of light in a single color is released. So that single frequency generated from there is light. It's visible. And improvements to diode technology, the number of individual discrete chips and also the color frequencies have been altered. Ugh, that mold's giving me a headache, so I'm going to hold this farther away from me. Because, mold. And I sprayed it with ammonia, which does not help. Very stinky. Not as stinky as the marker, though. Or as stinky as my content. So, that's how a diode generates light, but you may notice that there's an obvious issue here. The diode only flows in one direction. A diode can only conduct current in one direction. And that's the crux of it. That's where the scan line comes in. Because my walls don't produce DC. They don't produce anything. They transmit. So they produce AC, which, if you think of this as positive and negative of any given point, it's flowing in both directions. That's a sine wave, so that doesn't make much logical sense. The way to conceive of this, though, is actually kind of comical. So people think of electricity as a flow of electrons from a point source, which DC basically is. The electrons flow through conductive materials and go somewhere. AC is not. These are symmetrical in household AC. The forward and reverse is equivalent. So what you're actually seeing is the electrons are moving back and forth really fast. Like, they're going. So, people will say, oh, well, the electrons that come from the power plant, there aren't any. The electricity in the power lines is the same electrons that are always there, just going back and forth. In fact, because your house is insulated from lines with a transformer, which is a magnetic coupling device, your house doesn't contain any electrons from outside. You are paying to have electrons you already own move back and forth really fast. That's what paying for electricity is, which is a bit of a weird divergence here. The problem, when you run AC through a diode, as I said, the diode can only conduct in one direction. So with LEDs, it cuts. So your electricity actually looks like that in DC. So in America, and I think in most of the world, household outlets run at 60 hertz, which means this happens up and then down 60 times a second. When you cut off the bottom, it means that it's on, off, 60 times a second. So in actuality, when you turn on these lights, those lights are not on continuously like you would expect in an incandescent bulb. Those lights are turning on and off once every 1/60th of a second. So 60 times a second, those are off. Now, to the human eye, that doesn't really matter as much. The human eye is very different. So the human eye is actually a system of pixels, so to speak, very similar to a camera in that each one is a cell and it's sensitive to light. And when it hits light, it engages a chemical reaction that fires a nerve that goes through the back of your eye into your brain. We don't readily pick up the scan lines, though, because our brain doesn't just look directly at visual data. It can't. If you did, you'd probably go insane from just perceiving everything at once. It filters it. So pulses, hertz signals gets evened out in our brain. We don't see it. We can't. We probably could if you really focus. I don't know if anyone else has noticed this, but when I go into a bathroom at night, which I do a lot, because I drink a lot of coffee right before I go to bed to make me sleep with maximum energy. You come out of the bathroom after using, like, this is an LED light, so there might be a little bit of a scan line, but your vision's pulsating. It's going... I can't move my fingers very fast because I'm old. What is that pulsation? That pulsation, I think, is your brain compensating for the basically scan lines, that frequency, to even it out. Cameras don't do that. It just takes pixel data and relays it to you. Now, my particular camera runs at 30 frames per second, which means it's a series of images, and it captures these images one at a time, 30 per second. These lights are turning on and off at 60 times per second. So, I mean, theoretically, if they matched up exactly perfectly, you might be able to line them up, but they never do. They're always desynchronized a little. So the light source that you see is turning on and off to a degree. Let me make a little bit greater of a demonstration of that. So right now I've turned off the lights, and you may notice there's still light. The reason for that is because it's during the day. I usually film these at night, but I was very tired last night, so there's a small amount of light getting into my basement. Now if I shine this behind me, or underneath me, it should illuminate, and you may be able to see that there are scan lines moving by, because the lights are turning on and off. You can see them... hold on, this is easier described differently. It might be more easily described with this ball of Christmas lights. I always store Christmas lights in a ball with the male side of the plug facing out, so I can plug it in to test them very easily without unwinding the whole thing. LED Christmas lights have the same issue. They're a diode light source connected in parallel, essentially, to a single AC adapter, which is here. If you've ever looked at, like, Christmas lights, it's usually a big deal when you move them around. I don't know if you can see this, but I am actually starting to be able to see it, in that when you move them or move past them, they have what is sort of a visual texture, almost as if they're flashing. The reason you can see that, well, the reason I can see it, I'm very intrigued at looking at it. I really enjoy Christmas lights. I really like the color. I want to buy so many this year to do such a big display, but last year the gas company knocked them all over because for some reason you dig into the ground to fix gas lines in the middle of December, knocking over all the Christmas lights in the process. Weird choice of time to do gas lines, but the gas lines were apparently on the verge of exploding, so I am sort of glad they did it, because I'd rather not explode without it being on camera. But that issue is because, so if you imagine in a camera or an eye, you have, pixels, which in your eye is cells, in the camera it's tiny little, basically actually kind of photodiodes or transistors depending on the system, picking up light from a single point. If you're focused on one area, the light is all on one, and you don't really notice that it's flashing because your brain sort of filters it out, and the camera kind of filters it out. But when you move on, off, and then move it fast, and then on, you start switching, and there's these jumps where you begin to detect, oh, there wasn't light here, but there was here, was. And because the light is moving, you are more sensitive of the frequency of it, because it moves. It's basically turning on and off, so when it moves to a different cell off, and then you see it on in a different eye cell or a different camera cell, you are more able to detect the frequency. So 60 hertz is actually a really weird frequency. Visually, it is just at the range where we can begin to perceive it. Signals faster than that, we can't really effectively see them moving. So if you see a 60 hertz buzz, you can just barely sense it. Like, I'm sensing it from these Christmas lights. I don't know if you can see it because of the way the camera is, but if you ever look at LED Christmas lights, they have that. You notice it. Interestingly, it's also sort of at the range of sound we can hear. I actually have a bottle of it, 60 hertz sound in a jar. It was very hard to get it in here. This is a sine wave, so let's take a listen. I mean, it's not totally unpleasant. I mean, I also have this jar of 60 hertz sawtooth, so none of that. Which brings me to the question, how exactly do I go about fixing this? Not the Christmas lights. The Christmas lights are just here for amusement, for fun. How do I take my light source and potentially fix it? Well, I thought long and hard about that. So, there it is. Part of the problem with the reason this happens is poor design. These lights are not, I mean, I bought them at Walmart for super cheap. And this is the expensive one. I have cheaper ones, which I'll use for the demonstration later on. In that, these are two parallel light sources. Now, if you wanted to avoid hum, the thing to do would be to connect these in reverse polarity of each other. Which means one handles the wave when it's up, the other handles it when it's down. So one is always on while the other is off, and the other's off and the other's on. So that would essentially, it would equal out. The light you would actually see at a distance, and especially reflected off surfaces, would be equivalent. The light would always be on or off. They didn't do that. These are soldered in perfect parallel, so they're all the same polarity. It's always activated and always deactivated in sort of the same rate, producing that pulsing effect. The other option is what's called a bridge rectifier. So, bridge rectifier is actually pretty commonly used. Oh boy, I'm going to get laughed at for this. I'm not an electrical engineer and I can't draw good. So bridge rectifier is 4 diodes put in this sort of square shape so that when AC comes in on one polarity, say this is the positive at this particular moment, it goes up through this diode to the positive end. When it's negative, it goes down here to the negative end. And then this end, when it's the opposite, goes the other way. So if this one's negative, this one's positive. It goes up to the positive. It goes down to the negative. That will produce, your wave goes from wiggly going forward and back to all one direction, which if you think of the electrons as like ratcheting them. That would work, especially if you put in a filter capacitor to basically turn AC into lumpy DC and then pure DC, and that would work. I thought about taking this apart and applying that, but there is a problem. The problem being, this light works on the principle that the LEDs are only on 50% of the time. When it's in the reverse polarity, they're turned off. You can't see it because it's very fast, but they're off. If I suddenly turned it so that the LEDs were on all the time, that would be a problem, because now they're getting twice the power put through them, and I think they'd... That's the sound they make. That's the magical blue smoke, which, considering that they're probably made of gallium arsenide, is probably bad, and I don't want to breathe it. Also, this is like $30. $30 is a lot of money for me, so I don't want to break it. Which is why, for the demonstration purposes only, I created this. Now, what is this, you may ask? And those of you who do know what this is, you're asking, why, you filthy, dirty, absolutely disgusting schmuck, would you ever even conceive of building such a device? The answer is, this is an AC polarity reverser. It may very well be the only one of its kind in existence, because it's totally useless. In fact, utterly, completely pointless. With DC, polarity is the direction your electrons are going. As I already told you, in AC, the electrons are going both ways. There's no reason to change the polarity. They're already, it goes from doing this to doing this. They don't have a polarity. You can't change the polarity in AC, but this machine can. Why can this machine can? That's a good question that I don't fully know the answer to. This is the schematic of this machine. Now, I don't know entirely what this means, so freeze frame that and try to figure out the logic here. Imagine that all of these switches are connected, because they are. I glued them together with a stick. It's very important, actually, because if you were to close both at once, I'm pretty sure it would short circuit and explode. I think? Maybe? Essentially what it means is that you have two AC inputs. By changing the switches, I switch panel point 1 over here or over here. So it switches those two. I made it out of light switches and an outlet that I bought at Home Depot and wire that is way too small, and I put it all on a piece of wood that I found in my wood pile. This cord probably came from a fan. Do note that if you work with plugs and wall stuff, you can kill yourself real easy. Also note that our American outlets, type A, look like little frightened, sad faces. All the foreign people, foreign, that's kind of a rude way to phrase it, but all the foreign people who don't live in the United States or South America, the Americas, probably may not have necessarily seen our weird American little dude lights, type A with the ground pole. Those type A outlets are the reason why I built this thing. So you ever look at a plug? I look at these a lot. I consider this a lot. I'm always kind of concerned that these guys are staring at me from every single surface except that. There he is! I don't know if you can even see it. There's an outlet on the wall. I just pointed at him. The American plugs are polarized. There's a fat plug and a thin plug. This is problematic because it means that it only fits, I'm plugging it into itself. That's not going to power anything. But I also don't want to explode because I don't know if there's shorts in this thing and it will just explode. The problem being that American outlets, you can only fit it in one way. You cannot turn it around. I do not know why this is a thing in American outlets. Nobody can really give me a satisfactory explanation. If it was DC, oh, that makes sense. You don't want to put it in backward. It's AC. It's the same either way. Appliances will work if it's one way or the other. Why does one side need to be big? It doesn't matter in a lot of cases because there's a ground pole anyway. But that's what this machine does. As I said, it switches the source from side to side. So what that means is it produces a 180-degree phase shift. Huh. I just heard the sound of electrical engineers screaming at me. That's not how you do a phase shift. And then they just came up with a solution of here's how you would actually do it. It isn't technically a real phase shift, but it's equivalent in terms of what I'm trying to do here. So normally it goes like this, in that it's positive, negative, positive, negative. When you switch it the other way, because it's now reversed, it's negative, positive, negative, positive, which for an AC appliance doesn't really matter. It's still AC. It can accept it in either direction. But when you're running DC lights, that means that if you only use the upper, for example, if that's the way that the diodes all have the same polarity, it means that you've switched it. You switched the on-off cycles by 90? 180? I don't know. Again, I never really studied electrical engineering at all. I'm not an engineer. That's why this is made of way too small wires and a stick. Like that's how you control all the switches at once. I have hot glued a stick to 4 light switches to control the polarity. And it just so happens that I have 2 lights. You'll notice that these aren't the same as the gray light. They don't have a pull cord and they have half as many diodes. These are the $15 lights. They're somewhat cheaper. In case they explode, I lose less money. Also, I have a lot more of these. These are originally, again, for the plant stand, so that's where they will ultimately be going. But for this demonstration, I'm going to determine if using this device actually successfully inverts polarity. So right now, I have it marked so that when it is in this circle position, it's marked it with a marker, it's inverting. So right now, it is not inverting. So I'm going to take one light, and I'm going to plug it into the outlet. So that light is now lit. And I believe that if I am right about what you are seeing, there should be visible scan lines. I am then going to take these gloves and put them on. Now, these are not insulative gloves. They are dishwashing gloves from Lowe's. And they're moldy. But it'll give me at least a little bit of resistance to shock if this all goes downhill really fast. I should probably put the glove on the other hand, but I've already got this in my hand, so oh well. Let's see if I die. Oh, this is oddly frightening. Again, I'm not an electrical engineer, so this machine is exceedingly unsafe. I shall now plug this plug into my machine. You can see the light did not turn on because there is an arming switch. The original idea being that because this thing can explode, if you don't switch all the switches at the same time, you turn it off and on. So you turn it off, switch it, and then use it. So activating. turns on the light. There should still be scan lines visible. Don't know if there are. I've got 2 lights on me. 2 lights on you now. These lights are in phase, I believe, so they're turning on and off at exactly the same period. Okay, now for the terrifying moment of truth here. I have flipped the switch. This light is now turning off when this light is turning on, and this line is turning off when this light is turning on. So they are now flashing in inverse frequencies. And I can't really see that. If my hypothesis is correct, and I will judge it later, the scan line should have disappeared. Let's listen to future me and his conclusion. Future me.
You failed, you schmuck.
I'll have to wait to see what he says when I say it. So that should, as a light source, if these are combined physically close enough, they should eliminate the scan lines. If not, it does prove that my polarity reverser does not, in fact, explode. Let's see if it works the other way. So that should be one of the 2 states, probably plenty of scan lines, and scan lines gone. So it's a relatively unimpressive machine. I guess when they actually work properly, it's not nearly as entertaining for the viewers. Regardless of the situation. Mold. Well, I guess that's the end of the video. I don't know how long it actually was. Hopefully this one's relatively short. The last one took forever to edit, and I'm lazy. That's why I built this out of scrap instead of, actually doing something that would not kill me. Also, the ground plug isn't grounded, and that's probably bad, but I'm not 100% sure why. So, with that, I consider it a success. I always consider it a success, even when it's a failure, because at least you learn something. What is thing number 2? Thing number 2, I guess, is don't bother liking or following or subscribing, whatever people on YouTube do, because it doesn't matter. I don't get paid for this. I do it because I enjoy it. 3 is extra.